Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Let's Talk About It. And today I am over the moon excited to have Julie Wong on the podcast with us today. So, Julie is a psychologist in Nova Scotia, and we've known each other for a number of years now. And I have to say, you have like the best podcast voice. So, that was another reason why I was so excited to have you on here. Yeah. So welcome, Julie. Thank you for agreeing to come on here.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, it's always fun too to kind of have the opportunity to reconnect with people. And like you and I have a lot of private conversations on Instagram as well. That hopefully as we kind of walk along, that we can kind of elaborate on some of those conversations that we've had, because I just find you to be so insightful in terms of like the advice that you have on certain things. So yeah, this is going to be a good conversation. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you first get started into the world of psychology?
Oh, that's like going way, way back. I think somewhere in high school, like late high school years, I was interested in psychology. My brother actually took some psychology at university, and we had a lot of chats, and I realized, yeah, I think that's what I want to do too. So that's what I took in my undergrad, just a general psychology degree. Then I took a year off and trying to figure out what to do next. You can't really do a whole lot in terms of, you're not that employable I shouldn't say just, but with an undergrad in psychology, it doesn't really train you for something specific.
Right.
So I took a year off, came back home, and then I met up with a couple of psychologists who worked at the local mental health clinic. And once I started talking to them, then I knew, yes, I want to do this. I want to do what they do, which is clinical psychology, working with people. So then I went off to do my master's degree in clinical psychology and did my internship back here in Digby. And I was very lucky, just as I was finishing up all of my training, one of those psychologists who I'd met, she moved on, and her position came open for me. So, and I've been with that organization ever since.
Amazing. So how many years have you been practicing now?
A lot. I started working with the Digby Clinic here in 1992. So it's like a
Wow.
few decades. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's that's a long career.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, this would be a great question to start off with for you as well. Is a number of people who listen to this podcast are naturopathic doctors, or people who work in some type of service-based space. And someone like you, who is a bit of a veteran in terms of
Yes.
doing one-on-one, and also being able to like develop healthy boundaries, so
Yeah.
that having a clinical practice like that is sustainable. So could you offer us some insight into like what that looks like for you?
The boundaries part?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you asked that at this time, because I think that that's a conversation that can be had on so many different levels, right? So definitely in my training, we definitely would have talked about that and would have been prepared to kind of keep that appropriate boundary for therapist and client to have. There's been different terms used, but to all kinds of things, like boundaries around being careful that it's like it can feel like a social relationship, but it's not a friendship. It has similarity. It's not two-way. If we do personal disclosure, we do it because it benefits the therapy process and the client, not because we're needing to vent those obvious kind of things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's all that kind of thing. But then over the years, like I think as therapists, we all will encounter, probably whatever field we're in, but especially in ours, we'll encounter that sort of that difficulty where we are human beings. So even though we're trying to keep our professional boundaries, all of that, then there are going to be times in certain cases where we do get more how would I describe it? Like maybe more pulled in, right, on that more personal emotional level. And then we realize, okay, or maybe you're working with someone who yourself, you're going through a lot of the similar kinds of issues, and it can be harder to have that right amount of objectivity type thing. So there's all of that. And there's also things that we bring in, I think, from our personal histories. So I think many of us in our field, I think it would be fair to say, would be, we want to help people, right? We really want to be helpful, we want to be supportive. And I think as positive as that is, at times we have to learn our boundaries about around how much we can help, right? And we have to learn to let go. We have to learn to kind of help how we can help and let go. And that's where all of these other kinds of threads come in, where I shouldn't speak for my peers, they might not like that, but certainly for myself, for the longest time, I didn't understand clearly what codependency was. And then I think when I finally realized what that was, I realized, well, I didn't get it because I have a lot of that myself, right? This wanting to help so much and to have my own identity very wrapped up in how I could help the other, not just in my professional world, but in all my relationships. So that's a big boundary that I'm working on at this present time in my life, is kind of I knew the basics, but I'm kind of doing this fine tuning of recognizing, how to better balance, to make sure that whatever way I'm helping, is in proper balance with my own self-care and that whole theme. Does that making sense how I'm describing that?
Yeah, that does make sense. I find too that I'm glad you brought up the codependency element. Because I think too, just knowing what I know now or understand, and then also seeing like other people who are in service-based industries, that that codependency piece seems to be awfully common.
Yeah, and maybe we kind of missed it in previous decades, because when I first began, this is where I can speak because I'm a veteran. When we first began, that whole word seemed much more clinical and much more severe. For people, it was very much used in the addictions world. So the sort of the classic situation where there might be a couple and one person was, had a very severe alcohol addiction, and the other person was codependent, kind of inadvertently supporting that. And their identity was wrapped up in helping the person with the addiction. But we now, as you know, are using that term in a much broader way, outside of addictions, where we can get very wrapped up in having this identity of, we're all about being a helper to someone else, which is beautiful to want to help, but it's just so important that is done in as healthy a way as possible, which means that we are more than that, right? Our value is not an identity, ought to be more than just about being of service to others. We need to, first of all, we need to be of service to ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I've, with the codependency thing too, it's, like identifying with the ability to be able to help others, but not, and I'm sure you could speak more to this, but my understanding of like how I can work on that in my own personal life is trying to understand, like, yes, I am of help to others, but I am not identified by how well I can help others.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
Yeah. And it's tough. Like, I find it's a constant like workabout, right? Where you're constantly having to like remind yourself of these things. And yeah, I don't know if you feel the same way too about, when people come to you asking for help or wanting help, that it's, yeah, to not take on that responsibility because you want them, to be better, because it almost is a bit of a reflection of you and your performance as that, psychologist or as that naturopathic doctor or what have you. It's hard to not like take it on almost from like an egoic perspective too, I find.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I think that I don't expect to ever be finished this work, right? It's just that
Mm-hmm.
every decade I'm working on different layers of it. But it's so hard because, if we're entering into any kind of helping field, it's because we enjoy that. And it is part of our ego, which is not always a bad thing. I think of there being like healthy ego. I think it's healthy ego to feel good about oneself and we can be helpful to someone. But then we kind of have to, if we're that kind of a person and professional, then we have to learn over time what are the kind of boundaries that feel right for us, where we can enjoy the feeling good about helping someone, but at the same time not be overextending. And there's not like a cookie cutter kind of definition of that. I think we have to find it as we go along, create as we go along, and learn by trial and error that, oh, okay, in that period of my life, or in that case, I really overextended or really helped at an extreme expense to myself. But, so I think it's an ongoing process of work for all of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no like black and white guidebook of how exactly it's all supposed to be done.
Yeah, when I work with some people and they're working on this very thing, because many of my clients also have this struggle of, how do we balance like self-care and other care. And if some people are really needing at least some kind of framework, to use, sometimes I'll say, well, like if they're let's say they're trying to work on, maybe in their personal life, like work on trying to have better balance with family members, right? Where they're not wanting to be the one that's always taking care of everything, but they also don't want to abandon people either. Then I try to give them sort of a guideline, like, okay, well, how about practicing as much as you can in a day, looking at what your own needs and wants are first, let people take care of themselves, but save your overextending for crisis times, because during crisis periods, that's when it might be a little more appropriate, right? So if I get a call from my son that he's on the side of the road and I'm in the middle of if I'm in the middle of my tea, then of course I'm going to get up and go help, right? But if it's something else that he wants and it's not a crisis, he can wait. Well, I'll finish my tea and do my thing, and I'll say, yeah, I'll be there in an hour or whatever if he needs this or that. So I try to give that just as an example, because sometimes when people have spent their whole lives in service to others and they're totally out of touch with their own wants and needs, they don't even know how to decide how to go about doing that. So then I encourage them to overshoot if they need to. Like when you're learning something new, you can't do it perfectly. So just, take a period, do an exercise for a week. Just do everything you want to do, and people will survive around you unless it's like a crisis
Yeah.
situation, right? And learn to deal with the discomfort of that. Learn I might teach them mindfulness, that kind of thing, where you have to learn how to just be with those uncomfortable feelings of doing something very different than what you're used to, right?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because it's like the all or nothing kind of thinking, and I see that to be, I mean, maybe it's just like a theme in my life that I'm starting to become a little bit more aware of, in terms of like communication dynamics and even stuff that's happening like in Canada right now. But then like bringing it back to like, personal development, that all or nothing, like extreme stuff of exactly like that example where you're talking about, where sometimes it's appropriate to
Yes.
like intervene.
Overextend.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. One of the things too that I was thinking of when you were talking about that is the idea that taking time for oneself or saying no to others is like a form of selfishness, that perhaps people perceive it as being selfish. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm assuming I'm not really well traveled, so I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world. But definitely, we live in a culture where to be like selfless, for example, is really seen as a virtue, right? And I can understand that in a way, but I really feel strongly that that's just done. That's a disservice for so many people, right? I mean, I can see it in my work, right? That people do feel very selfish. They feel bad for wanting to do what they want to do, and so I feel like my role often is to teach people something different, to help them unlearn that and relearn a better balance. So yeah, so I'm a big believer that I don't think I ever use the word selfish, right? It's not really a common one in my vocabulary, because I think that it's not been very helpful, I think, in our culture. And I'm glad to see that there seems to be a real movement around making that difference, right? All the time you're on social media and you're often seeing these quotes about self-care is not selfish, that kind of thing. So we're moving in the right direction, I think. And certainly I think for mental health and emotional wellness, yeah, we need to move away from that idea that self-care is selfish. It's necessary for good emotional well-being. Well, if we need to be selfish, then we need to be selfish, right? But I don't call it that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And I also think too, and I mean, I would love your insight on this stuff as well with, childhood development, right? Or even like generationally that, you see like your grandmother or your mother behaving a certain way of like being completely selfless. And then believing as a child with like your lenses of like how the world is, that then you take that on and think that that's the way that you're supposed to behave. Yeah, the generational element there is, I find that to be really fascinating.
Yeah, well, I hope it's okay. Like, so you're the interviewer here, but I hope it's okay for me to ask you some questions too.
Yeah, of course.
Because I'm really impressed by you that you belong to a generation that is stereotypically, seen as being more able to focus on, oneself. And there's a whole lot of these stereotypes that I find that you don't fit. And I'm curious and I have met others. I've met others through my work who probably are in your same age group, and I've asked them. There are two young guys who I work with, and I said, "Yeah, you guys really seem really different from other people in your generation, or at least the stereotype of that." And I think one said that he thinks it's because he had much older parents than a lot of his peers, and that had a different influence on him. And then the other one said he thinks it's because of growing up in rural Nova Scotia, that
Mm.
that gave a much more, he felt that that made him into a much more practical, kind of grounded person, like not so carried away by whatever the trend of his generation was. So I would see you also as sort of in this group of people, what I would think of as a smaller group, who seem different from your cohort, kind of, right? So I was curious why you think you're that way.
Do you mean in terms of like, can you describe a little bit more specifically
Yeah,
about,
well,
yeah.
even okay. You don't like cookie cutter. I know from listening to to you, right? And I think that there's quite a few people in your age group who kind of like the cookie cutter thing. It makes things simpler, and you don't. It means that you don't have to be afraid of doing things wrong. You just follow the cookie cutter.
Mm.
There's many like that, not all. And what else? Well, you're very like you're very open to sharing what you think of as your own weaknesses, your own vulnerabilities, your what you would think of maybe as your imperfections, for lack of better words. And I don't hear that a whole lot, right? From from
Mm.
people. In fairness to the others, maybe I'm not around them enough, but I guess, and maybe they're just stereotypes. But you do strike me as being different in
Well,
that way.
thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you for that.
in a positive way. Yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah,
don't know. Maybe you're an old soul. I don't know because they're
maybe.
yeah.
I mean, I grew up in like small town rural Ontario, in a town of 250 people. I'm not entirely sure that that had much to do with it. Um, for me personally, I think just growing up, I think I've always kind of felt different, or like an outsider, um, or maybe like just I've always questioned things, like even as a child, like really questioning like what's the meaning of life, and like why are we all here? And even like going so far as like into like the whole like spiritual and energetic realm of wondering about different worlds, and what happens after death, and like so all those types of things are always things that I've really been like very deeply inquisitive over. Like even as a child, those are always things that I was curious about. um, and I think that just because of that curiosity and the questioning constantly of things kind of led me to perhaps have a few different experiences than maybe what might have been the norm, if you will, for someone of my generation. But I also think too that just so I started developing an eating disorder when I was like 11 or 12. And over the years, I think I was probably about 15 when I started in therapy. And I think, again, that was a unique thing that I don't know a lot of people my age who started therapy when they were in their teens or like go to therapy at all. And so I think just having that, um, a lot of therapy. And then when I was hospitalized when I was 17 too, it was the same, it was like deep therapy of like just throw everything out that you're possibly thinking, because we're going to analyze like everything that you're experiencing. And I think that kind of opened me up to perhaps be more comfortable than maybe the average person to talk about like my insecurities.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense to me that you're saying that. I think it might be a combo then, because as you were describing yourself as a child, I was very similar to that. Yeah. So maybe there's always a group of people. It'd be interesting to see what the numbers are. I haven't looked at the research on that. Maybe there hasn't been any. But maybe there's always a group of people at all times, that are a little bit different in this way than maybe the bigger, like the majority, right? Maybe there are people who fall at the end of the bell curve, in that way, and that were maybe not quite as influenced by whatever the trends of our generation are. Because I remember at one point I always thought, I feel like I should have grown up like in the hippie era. Like there were times that I kind of felt that way because when a lot of my views are very. I have a sciencey part of my mind, but there's another part of my mind that is not Western sciencey, right? And so I think it was often during those times I was thinking, well, maybe I was born in the wrong generation type thing. So yeah, so maybe it's something, the closest I've come to kind of looking at something that would suggest that there's a small group that sort of stands out a little bit from, and not to put value judgments on it, there's pros and cons on both sides. But I read the book quite a number of years ago. I read the book, The Highly Sensitive Person.
Yes.
And her research suggested that in all groups, in human groups and animal groups, there's about 30% of, of people or animals in that group that were kind of more highly sensitive. And then she had a whole bunch of attributes that would go along with that sensitivity. And so that's the only number that I've ever come across. I'm thinking, well, maybe that's 30% applies to other things that I notice as well. But I haven't come across any other research. If you ever do, please let me know.
Yeah, I will let you know. A couple weeks ago, I had Kayla Clark on the podcast, and she's a naturopathic doctor. She explores some elements of, I guess, neurobiology that I find to be really interesting. And the one thing that she had mentioned was highly sensitive people or empaths tend to have higher amounts of mirror neurons.
Yeah.
Which with that relation. So I can see that, but then also the element too of people who, and I think this has something to do with mirror neurons actually, now that I'm thinking of it, is people who tend to be more creative in the creative spectrum, and maybe you've noticed this too, like in your own experiences, also tend to really experience life in perhaps a little bit more of a colorful way emotionally.
Yeah.
So like those correlations between rates of depression and anxiety and creativity. Have you ever seen information about? I've read about it before, but don't know.
Yeah, I'm not as a person who does as a clinician, in mental health in the public system, as well as doing clinical psychology. One thing I don't do as much as I would like to, there just doesn't seem to be a natural room for it in my life, is I'm not up on the research. So I tend to look mainly at the research that comes down to me that's, to do evidence-based kinds of work.
Yes.
So yeah, I haven't looked into that, but I've certainly heard a lot of that talked about over the years, in terms of that whole connection between anxiety and creativity, all that kind of stuff. But I haven't studied it a lot. But I'm really excited by all this research that's been doing on the brain,
Yes.
right? And understanding it, even though I'm not highly sciencey, not extremely sciencey, relatively speaking, I do find that part really interesting, how they're looking at even attachment styles and noticing that the brains of those, for example, I think I listened to a podcast that said that there's research showing that those who have more the anxious attachment style, they notice that there's this very clear brain differences. I should have written it down because it really made a lot of sense to me in terms of, maybe it'll come to me before the end of the podcast, but it just made a whole lot of sense. Suddenly there was like that light bulb moment. I said, okay, now I get it, why people of that attachment style would think certain ways or would experience, certain things in relationships. And anyway, it's just really helpful. Like, I mean, even in terms of certain kinds of personality types, they've now, it's not brand new research, but they can see things, for example, that parts of the parts of the brain that are, I think it's probably the amygdala, that control, that are related to very basic primitive emotions. They've noticed that there's variation depending on personality of what that part of the brain is like, as well as the part of the brain that helps to manage those emotions. There's differences, right? So it's just really great that this is coming out, and it gives more, I think it gives greater understanding to these individuals, so that, and for them too, so that they don't feel like, oh, well, it's just a character flaw on my part. You know, when there's actual brain differences, it gives a lot of validation to people, knowing that, yeah, I have this difference that's going to make things a little, I'm still responsible for dealing with it, but it means that I've got something that makes me a little more vulnerable in that way. And I might need some extra support and understanding, and I'll, need to do a little more work to support myself through that.
Absolutely. And I find like the world of mental health, and I'm happy to see, just like what you said, that, it's becoming more talked about and researched even. But I find the world of mental health has its taboos on it, just because of the fact that you can't see anxiety, you can't see depression, you can't see those things. And then it immediately is almost imposed on that person that, and I hate this word, but I can't think of another one to say, because it's just like that. Those are kind of like the norms of how we would describe someone as being like crazy or delusional, right? Because, and then the whole idea of like, oh, just suck it up, when you're dealing with something that is a mental health related thing.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I'm really shocked that after so many decades that I've worked in this area, that we still are having, we still are dealing with that whole stigma. I mean, and I think that we've been working on it all this time to try to reduce the stigma, to increase understanding, and I do think it's improved, but we still have so far to go. And that, and you're right, these things that we can't see, unless you've gone through it yourself, like had a taste of it firsthand, it's very hard to understand it. And I think, yeah, those people who struggle, well, we all struggle to some degree. I don't tend to believe that it's an either or. I tend to believe it's more of a continuum, right? For all of us. And if you're lucky enough, you're on the continuum, the side of the continuum where it's so low that you would consider yourself not having, and you struggle with anxiety or depression. But once it gets at a certain point on that continuum, then it can become very disruptive. But I know that people who have that, as far as we've come, people do often still feel like a real failure, and feel a lot of shame. And yeah, and it's partly in the West too, that we think of as the mind and body as more separate than it really is. And that was helpful at one point to make that distinction. But I think that can also contribute to the stigma as well. Like when we see the mind and body being so different, but really in Eastern, as you know, like an Eastern understanding of health, I mean, there's much less distinction between the two, right? And in that way, I think it would give rise to less stigma if it's all one and just different parts of the same system, right? But we somehow think that there's something wrong with you, like, you're weak, or your character is bad if you have a mental health type problem. But if it's a physical problem, well, that's not at all your fault. But that could be your responsibility as well, right? If you're not well because you're not eating and exercising, well, that speaks to your character as well, right? So but we tend to do this real division in the West. It's changing, thank goodness, but for a long time we've had that very extreme division, which is, I don't believe, is real, right? So,
no, completely. And that's been something I've even noticed recently too, in terms of like learning more about skincare, and it's one thing to say, oh, what, like stress causes like acne breakouts, or stress can aggravate your eczema or whatever. But it's quite another thing when there's actually like evidence, like from like a biological perspective, of how cortisol, like a stress hormone, can actually influence on a cellular level what's happening in your cells. So it's cool too, just to start to see this world like expanding more, especially in Western medicine, where we're so concerned about evidence-based everything. Everything
Yeah.
needs to have a research paper to back it up. And, you know, I can see the merit in that, but at the same time, like, there's also parts of health and healing and well-being, and especially mental health, that, you know, are going to be very difficult to compartmentalize into a research study.
Yeah, especially a Western, framework, yeah, research study, like the more mainstream one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, I mean, like you say, I think the evidence base definitely has its role,
Hmm.
for sure, but it's kind of a sin if we throw out everything else that we can't prove in that way, especially things that have stood the test of time, right? Things that have, that have people have been using for thousands of years,
Yeah.
more so in other parts of the world. Yeah, we ought not to be throwing that out, or yeah, things that we don't understand. And I am really pleased to see that I think we are, we seem to be moving in that direction of wanting to kind of, if we could just bring the both worlds together, that would be the ideal, right? To look at
Yeah.
what can we, in terms of healthcare, in terms of quality of life, if we can bring in what both, looking at, there's many ways to look at, but if we can bring in what the West and East have had to offer, in terms of, you know, yeah, improving health, treating disease, all of that, that would be ideal, as well as opening our minds to things that we have not yet explored as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely. And yeah, not just like what you said about, you know, there's traditions, like healing traditions all over the world that have been around for, you know, thousands of years.
And it's very hard if,
Hundreds of thousands.
yeah, if you've grown up in the West and you haven't had exposure to anything else, it's very hard to think outside that box, right? I think that myself, even though like my parents were immigrants to this country, and my father was someone who believed in leaving all the Chinese traditions behind because that would get in our way, but my mom didn't believe that. So we still did get a taste of Chinese medicine, that kind of thing. So I saw that as a child. So even though I was brought up in this Western society, and my training and all that is quite Western, it wasn't hard for me to open my mind up to that whole other more Eastern type understanding, of life and health and all that, because I had those early influences, thank goodness, from my mom, right? So I could understand that, yeah, when you have this ailment or that ailment, she'd go to the cupboard with all the big jars of various, things that she would get sent over and make up a soup. So yeah, so it wasn't hard for me. And then I went away from that for a long while, like somewhere along the way. And then at some point I came back to that because it didn't take me long to see that it's not complete, right? That the Western framework itself, that's the problem. It's good for some things, but then it's not complete. And that's my sense of what's happening now. It's like at our point in history, in terms of, health and treatment, we're realizing that, well, there are missing pieces.
Mhm.
We're having all these ailments. We're seeing that, very narrow kind of Western treatment is not resolving that. So we need to look outside of that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I agree with you. It's almost, I kind of liken it to um putting like someone in a box thinking that they can survive there without giving them any light at all, right? But then realizing that, you know, that like that person or that plant or whatever, what have you in this example, requires, you know, something that we actually take for granted every single day, that it's part of, you know, living a good life and being like healthy and vibrant. And um yeah, mental health to me is that like piece of sunlight that I think the Western world in terms of health hasn't really understood how vital it is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, for sure.
So you also practice yoga,
Hmm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you share with us a little bit about your experience of yoga with like personal development, mental health, or what have you?
Yeah. I think that yeah, I think I got interested in meditation before I got interested in yoga. I think in my 20s, I've always had like an anxious type temperament. And I think I turned to meditation as a way of, finding, being able to, get calmer. and which really helped get more grounded. And then I think for years I wanted to do yoga as well, and for some reason I didn't start yoga as a personal practice till I think 2005, I think, and then yeah, I started doing, I started taking yoga classes, and then I really enjoyed it, so I kept going. And then at some point, I think one of my teachers encouraged me to get my yoga teacher training because she thought that I'd be good in that role, and also it also was being offered just as a way of deepening one's own yoga practice. So yeah, so I thought about that again for years and didn't do it right away. But then I think there was a time where it became everything goes like through these trends, and I noticed that a lot of my clients, like a lot of my clients in my psychology world, they were really wanting to know more about yoga, and they knew I practice yoga. So I started sometimes showing them things. I stand up and show them poses they could do, that kind of thing. And after a while, I thought, well, geez, I shouldn't be doing this. Like I should be getting trained if I'm going to keep doing this. And I could really see the value of it. So I think a combination of wanting to deepen my own practice, having thought about it for a long time, and then seeing how much interest there was, among my own clients, and a lot of my clients, because they were very anxious, they didn't want to go to a class, right? And they felt more comfortable just asking me because they knew me to show me this, and so I thought, yeah, okay, I better go and get my training so I know what I'm doing and don't do anything that causes someone to hurt themselves. So that's how I got into it. I also really like the idea of growing like a practice of combining the two more, of bringing, combining, yoga and psychotherapy. I really liked that idea because again, there were times that I was working with people providing psychotherapy that I kind of would feel like, oh, like there's a missing piece that I think that they could really benefit from beyond psychotherapy to address anxiety, depression, or whatever other emotional difficulties. So that's where the interest, yeah, that's sort of, yeah, that's the background of how I get into yoga and then yoga teaching.
I love that. So in terms of the yoga, what are some elements or parts of yoga that you find were helpful for people with the anxiety?
I didn't ever end up doing it a whole lot, like in my public system work, because I did it a little bit, but then at one point, things were getting a little more, how would I say it? I think there was a concern about doing that, I think because of liability,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then I only did that a little bit, but I had, I think there were people who, some of my peers would refer some of their clients to me, like who were dealing with anxiety, but wanted to explore yoga. And so I basically would meet with them and, find out what level they were at, if they had any, prior experience with yoga, and then just basically selected various poses to teach them that might help to, reduce their anxiety. And then I think that, and the same, I think with depression, the people who wanted to kind of use yoga poses to help with depression, I just basically kind of tried to match them up with a few poses to teach them that way. And I wanted to keep expanding, that whole integration, but somewhere along the way, I'm not sure what happened. One thing I realized I learned is that I didn't really ever want to teach like big classes. I really wanted to do more this integration of yoga and psychotherapy, but I realized that I had to keep doing some kind of regular yoga teaching, because when I worked one-on-one with one client, I realized that I forgot how to lead someone in a pose. So then I started teaching small groups just in my home yoga space, just to keep my teaching skills up. So I did that for a while, and I kept trying to work towards integrating the two, but then COVID hit, and then I stopped my classes. So lately I haven't really been doing much on that whole front of combining, but I do want to get back to it at some point, but I just haven't figured out just how I'll do that. I've kind of gone away from my own personal yoga practice more than I want to. So that's probably the first step is, I've been going through quite a long phase now of just doing really basic stuff each morning. And I'd like to first grow that, and then see where that goes, and see where we go with COVID as well.
Yeah. I find it's to teach other people or Yeah, it's like you have to be doing it yourself, right? In order to
But
be able
yeah,
to like,
well, both, yeah, like, I
yeah,
mean, both, because yeah, like, and even when I'm doing it myself, like, I think I'm not a natural. I think some people are naturally stronger in narrating.
mm,
So with me, I haven't done enough teaching to be really strong in narrating, how to guide people, into the pose. So I use a lot of demonstration. Like if I'm lacking in the words to guide them, then I actually just do the pose. And that's kind of the tradition I was trained in anyhow, where
yeah,
you're in the same space, you're actually doing the pose as you're guiding. And I rely a lot on that. But I find, yeah, it takes a lot of practice, I find, to find the words to get people into the position they need to be in. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does. I can relate to that because after I did my yoga teacher training, um, I actually hired my yoga instructor at the time. We would get together on Friday afternoons, and she would teach me how to be a good yoga instructor. But it still never came naturally to me. Like, just even the words that you use, and trying to use as little words as possible, but still try to get across like the essence of how you want that person to get into a pose. It's a complete art, really.
Yeah, totally. Like even things. This is kind of funny, but even like when you go to do down dog, right? Like
Yeah.
even in terms of how you put your toes, like is it tuck your toes or is it like
Yeah.
like because tucking sounds funny. Tucking sounds like you're curling them, but and so even that's just a little example. There's all these little movements that you know how to do them, but to guide someone else simply and to not confuse them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's a real art,
Yeah.
and yeah, one that I certainly have not refined yet.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. That was it reminds me too of kind of what you're talking about with, I love that you're integrating, or were at one point in time, the psychotherapy with the yoga. Um, that kind of reminds me a bit of have you ever read The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk?
But I haven't read it. No.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. So the second half of the book is all about, suggestions of things that he thinks that people can be doing in their everyday life, and one of those things is yoga.
Yeah.
Yeah, in integration with some of the trauma work that he was doing with these people.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
I do. Well, I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's kind of piquing my interest again, a little bit too. And that's why it's so important, I think, to have conversation like this too, because some things can kind of go almost into a dormant kind of state somewhere inside of us, right? And then it takes kind of interaction to begin thinking and stimulating that part. And I do have one example. I think there's a lot of different ways to integrate yoga. So I had one client a while back in my private practice who she enjoyed doing yoga, and also she had a lot of body issues, and it was very hard for her to open up initially. And then one day her back was really bothering her, so I just asked her if she wanted to sort of lay down on the yoga mat and do the session that way. And when she did it that way, just in that position and feeling more relaxed, I might have done a bit of a relaxation, guided relaxation with her as well in the beginning. It made for a completely different session, right? She was able to kind of talk and open up in a way that was very different than usual when she was sitting up straight looking
yeah,
at me. So that it can even be integrated in very basic ways like that, just allowing people to get into a body position and state that is much more comfortable. And I've used it that way too, where I have people right at the beginning, we might do a bit of sort of just mindful breathing, or I might take them through a guided meditation, or I might get them to do just a couple of yoga poses at the beginning, and that can just change the whole psychotherapy session. So it can be integrated in very simple ways that way too.
yeah. Would you say, just from your experience, that you notice that people hold like perhaps stress, or just some type of negative thought or what have you, like in different parts of their body? Do you notice that?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't really integrated that kind of piece in my psychotherapy work, but yeah, you can definitely see it actually. Like even if I look back, I mean, yeah, I'm doing mostly Zoom. I'm not doing in person therapy, but often a person's posture will be quite different from by the end of the session after they've actually shared
Yeah.
things that they needed to share and have that, and shared in a supportive, space and have that validated, that often people's body and face is much softer, right? Yeah, I've seen that over and over. Yeah. So I didn't really think of it in that way, but in looking back, I've seen that over and over again, that yeah, a person will look different at the end of the session. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you can see they're tighter, like they're holding, right? Their whole body and face is like a container, right? And then once they've been able to let that go and get the support, get the validation, yeah, they look pretty different in face and body.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard some of the stuff like that too. So Sadhguru has been someone lately that I've been interested in reading, and he even mentions that when he started regularly practicing yoga, that his appearance had changed just simply because of the way that he was holding himself after starting to integrate mind and body through a yogic practice. So
Mm,
it's possible. It's really fascinating,
yeah.
the experiences of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I think this is a good place to kind of wind down our conversation.
Okay.
If there's one last piece of advice that comes to mind that you feel like would benefit all of us, what would it be? It's a broad question.
Yeah, I think that it's I hate to say it this way in one sense because it sounds so cliche and trendy, but I think where I'm at in this decade of my life is kind of learning to do the self-care, self-love thing like at a sort of a much deeper level, or maybe I can say much fuller level than I've had in previous decades. And I think that that's the most important thing, I think, is to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves the best we can with the resources that we can, because that really needs to be the foundation for everything,
Yeah.
right? So I think that it's so important for people to take, time and space to get in touch with what they're needing. Like, not so much to look at a list. You can look at the list, but I think that to choose what you're going to do from that self-care list, the first step is to really take that time to get in touch with what you're needing at this time in your life, and to do your best to give that to yourself. And that's going to look different for everyone, right? Sometimes what we need to be doing is doing more of the hard work, and to take care of ourselves better. Sometimes it's going to mean doing the easier, what we think of as more indulgent things for ourselves, or anywhere in between. But I think the key is getting to know oneself well enough, taking that time to kind of become aware of what you're needing. And if it's something that's really hard to do, for some people, they're just, I don't know, for a whole variety of reasons, they're just so out of touch with what they want and need, that they may need support in that. So to reach out for support, and that can be through friendship, it could be to see a therapist, it could be your naturopath, it could be whoever you're comfortable to work with that on, to get that help in identifying, what it is that you're most needing and wanting to move towards better wellness.
Yeah. No, I love that, and I'm glad that you said that too, because I think that's the one part that I see quite common is people not feeling like self-care means asking for help. That is also a part of it too. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
What do you mean? Like, some people are not seeing?
Like, in a sense that like self-care seems like an individualized thing where you do it alone. Self-care can
Okay.
also mean that you ask for help when you need it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, because I think if people can stop and take some time to try to get a sense of what they're needing most, maybe what they're needing most is that support,
Hmm.
right? Maybe they're needing someone who can be a support person to them,
Yeah.
um, for whatever it is that they're needing that input on, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
even if it is to figure out what they're needing more of, because it's very true. I think that we live in a culture still where busyness is often reinforced. Sort of fast-paced, busy lifestyle is often encouraged, and it can mean that there's many people who don't know how to slow down on their own um, and get self-aware. It can be also very uncomfortable for people.
Yeah.
So for some people, it might be more comfortable to do it in a context of someone else helping them through that, or maybe a group, or yeah, I think those of us who have that more introspective aspect, we sometimes forget how hard it is for someone who does not naturally have that more introspective or introverted aspect of themselves, and they a lot of people thrive better who are more extroverted. They thrive better, with others, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
completely. Self-care also involves community and connection.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Julie. That was an amazing conversation. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode just as much as I did. Please don't forget to like this podcast, subscribe, and share it with anybody who you feel like could benefit from the message.